Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Again, to bring you a quick walkthrough of the Ruby life pools. I did a 21 fortified as disc, and I wanted to talk through some of the gameplay around it, some of the playstyle, some tips and tricks that I picked up, as well as what some of my teammates are thinking, how we work through the route, all that other fun stuff, okay? First and foremost, I'm using basically the exact same build that I have on Wowhead. For my disc guides, it is the Shadow Covenant and Twilight Equilibrium setup that I have going on. Going into Light's Wrath, Blaze of Light, all that good stuff. The idea behind it is that you're going to be able to weave Twilight Equilibrium during a Shadow Covenant to be able to maximize your burst output and provide the output, the burst healing that you need to be able to keep everybody alive through a lot of the heavy and also predictable damage that Ruby Life Pool has. One of the big priorities for this dungeon is also clearing out some of the ice barriers. I was using both my regular Dispel Magic and Mass Dispel to clear out any of the shields that the Chill Weavers have, as those will allow other mobs to be able to cast freely without threat of being interrupted. And so clearing through that debuff is insanely important, and it's also nice because we're doing a lot of high trash density pulls early on in the instance, to be able to have the healer focus on removing those debuffs so that everybody else can focus on the ridiculous amount of stops, void zones, the rest that are around the room. Throughout damaging, I am multi-dotting very heavily with Purge the Wicked on as many mobs as I can. Not really worrying about the whelps, obviously, but they kind of get cleaved out of Revel in Purity, Purge the Wicked, etc. from using Penance anyway. Making sure I'm using as many Divine Stars as I can. And you'll notice I'm not using a lot of Shadow Covenant from just a raw damage perspective. I'm trying to use Shadow Covenant fairly sparingly, unless I really need it to be able to heal. Once you get more comfortable, you can definitely spam it like crazy. You do consume a decent clip of mana at the beginning here, but since we have a Shroud skip slash just like a sap skip, basically, after these mobs are all dead, we will actually have time to be able to grab a drink. And I think this is one of the things that I did miss out on the dungeon, was not actually drinking when I otherwise could have before we skipped over to this point. Because unfortunately, discs in combat mana regen is quite poor, so we kind of just skip through, work to get a really good patrol timing so that we don't have to worry about the big rock man. If you have like a distract option available, you could always utilize that to be able to keep the rock in place. But we only are fighting just the normal regular trash mobs. We shroud skip past the first rock elemental, and then we have this second skip as the patrol is far away to be able to make sure that we're getting away from that one as well. This is a decent time just to make sure that people are also stocking up on cooldowns. As the first boss fight, the damage that everybody takes in the boss fight is dependent on how quickly that you push her. The more ice tornadoes that you get, the more challenging it really can be to be able to do the encounter. And so making sure that you have a lot of damage on pull will then phase her. I believe it's every 30% or so. The more that you are able to push her into phases and burn down a lot of health throughout these phases, the easier that your life is going to be. And you'll actually see the way I think that the damage priority would work really well for our composition. Since we have a hunter and he's got like the interrupt bow or whatever it is, he's able to interrupt Melodrusa's ice barrier, but on like a minute cooldown or something along those lines. And so in a perfect world, we would be able to have the hunter interrupt the first barrier and pop a bunch of damage cooldowns to make sure we force her to get to that first damage barrier, and then kind of tap the brakes and delay until the next barrier comes out. That can be interrupted, and then we can have more damage onto the boss. I'm not sure if it's going to stay that way, as we're well overdue for a lot of different dungeon changes, but that was the idea behind what we were trying to do to minimize group-wide damage. Whenever these chill storms do go out, I did use Goblin Jump here to make sure that I could quickly and efficiently kind of get out of that tornado, and then avoided clearing my Thundering. I stepped away from the melee DPS who all had blue markers so that I could still benefit from the healing buff as that storm was going out. So for this, we really try to be able to like cycle through cooldowns at a very consistent basis to be able to heal through them. And then when it comes to playing disc, you can really very aggressively burn mana to be able to increase output when you need to. And that's wonderful when you need to burst, but there's a number of different times where you need to be playing a lot more safe, a lot more conservative with your mana, and that's why it's important to sort of pace yourself there. So what I was working on here was trying to make sure I got my Harsh Discipline stacked up and ready to go before we got into that next Chill Storm after the first barrier. Didn't quite get it there in time, but that's the idea behind what I want to do, is charge up my healing, get Harsh Discipline ready, and then have a powerful Twilight Equilibrium Weave on hand and set to go. Since this next Chill Storm is happening a little bit too quickly for everybody, we do take advantage of Barrier here, watch out for Thundering, and then we do also have to deal with like the Thundering buffs. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to like step further back because of where I placed my barrier, so I didn't have the Thundering buff on hand to be able to deal with this. But to this point, I've still saved Rapture. I did so because I got the very first Chill Storm on myself, and I used Goblin Jump there. And so I would have used Rapture the second that I had gotten another Chill Storm, because your time to be able to get out of it is extremely rough. Here, we had an experience of Demon Hunters, but we were able to survive, thankfully, because I knew that the fight was going to be winding down soon, and I didn't want to take forever to be able to, just hold on to cooldowns. So as you can see, I used both a Shadow Covenant burst and a Rapture burst to be able to kind of keep everybody alive on this. And then for the final one, I have both my defensives on hand, taking cooldown reduction, and lots of it when it comes to utilizing Fade is insanely valuable and insanely important. And the hope from this is that you force the boss into the Chill Storm very quickly. At least the first one. And then if you have damage cooldowns coming up shortly afterwards, then you can kind of pool them until you're getting closer to the next shield break phase, either to break it itself or to use the interrupt, stop the shield from occurring from the hunter, and then continue burning the boss faster after that, so you get more boss damage. That's the idea. When it came to utilizing defensives, we made sure that there was sort of a vibe check as to how much damage the knockback, because usually it was the tornadoes. Whenever we progressed in that fight, it would be like the tornadoes burst, that final tick of damage would deal the most to everybody. And making sure people knew that they had to be above 40% health, above 50% health, whatever it is as you get into those keys, makes a big difference for timing a health pot, timing a health stone. I would also try to call if I was going to use Powered Life on somebody, but usually I use Powered Life after the tornado pushback ended as a mana efficient way of kind of topping somebody off, because Powered Life on its own doesn't really do enough to kind of get you over the hump on that one. We do go to the right. The first time, this route does not actually take Flame Gullet at all, so we're going to go to the right side towards Flame Gullet initially, but we are going to end up skipping around him and then go from there into like Thunderhead type setup. The Blazebound Destroyer obviously deals crazy amounts of burst, and once again, using it as an opportunity to Twilight Equilibrium Weave to pump out the most healing to everybody makes a world of difference. And I do try to make sure, whether it's Fade, Desperate Prayer, or even the single target Protective Light, the Flash Heal buff that you're able to get onto yourself, all of these defensives are immensely valuable. And it's really going to be about making sure that you're watching each pulse of damage, similar to what I said out of Melodrusa, where you're saying, oh, every tick out of that Inferno is going to be 20% of somebody's life, 30% of somebody's life. So you know that if you wanted to actually effectively time a Powered Life cast, that there's going to be moments where somebody will drop low enough for you to be able to utilize it. Unfortunately, even though you can Mind Soothe Flame Gullet, you do have to sit and wait around for him to actually take off, because he did social aggro for us. I think it was on beta when we tried to just like pull the Scorchlings around him and not him, and that was very much not fun. So we took the time, we waited around for him, and then pulled him into the next set of Blazebound Destroyers. And with this, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to not have to deal with a mob, which could be extremely scary and annoying to deal with. Also, the Living Bombs are going to be having the interrupts going out, so we have those for like the Flame Dancers, for example. And there's a lot of different stops that are required for this. One of the important ones is the Cinder Weaver has a dispellable magic effect on themselves, which increases their haste, and it also makes them take like 20% more damage. It's like a medium amount of extra damage taken. If you have only one Cinder Weaver, we opted to keep this going very, very consistently on that one target, and we're fine with him taking more damage and then having to deal with some more spellcast in return. But there is one of these destroyer packs that does actually require you purge it off, and probably purge it off both of them, because there's 2 of the Cinder Weavers on hand. So it's always something to keep in mind when you have to deal with 2 of them. I believe it's going to be like the last pack that we deal with. If you're able to make sure that you're killing off that one quickly and focusing the Cinder Weavers in particular, that'll help a lot. The problem that you get in this dungeon is there's unavoidable damage from the destroyer, but there's also a lot of single target like nuke damage on random allies. And so your DPS need to have like the wherewithal to know when you want to interrupt one or the other, because there might be a cast going through onto the tank, and your tank is going to be a solid rock, or will have spell reflect or something. And then there's going to be other times where your tank is going to need all the support they can get. I can't stress enough how important it is to pre-immune. We had our rogue preemptively use his cloak on this one, which helped a lot. But also to weave between either barrier or rapture to be able to set up your healing on Thunderhead. You get everybody in together before the debuffs come out. The 2 debuffs come out, everyone's already in barrier, you instantly dispel, reducing everybody's damage taken, and then for that final person that has the dot debuff, then you're going to be able to have that additional person to kind of take care of and babysit, but they're also taking less damage because they're still in barrier. I actually did not use Rapture here, but I wish I did looking back at it, because it's just an easier way of making sure you don't get kind of like caught on the back foot. Because sometimes the dot damage will be so heavy that you're afraid of dispelling somebody for fear of them dying, or the other person dying. And so the more time that you spend agonizing over that decision, the more likely somebody is going to die. You have to make an immediate response to be able to clear those debuffs. But I do use Rapture into the next pull. This is the very dangerous one with double Cinder Weavers, and as I mentioned, we purged off both of those effects, and we made sure that we are, again, focusing them and making a call for when we have the living bombs, so that we're able to say, oh hey, we're going to get this interrupt, you don't need to worry about anything from there. This makes a really big difference for our entire group. As you can see, Karm did get hit by a Cinderbolt at the very end because people switched targets very quickly. They switched to the Destroyer because that Cinder Weaver was going to die. He got hit by the Inferno damage, which is unavoidable, and then he got hit by the Bolt and just gets comboed and killed as a result. That's the real deadly thing that happens in this specific trash pull. This is the first Destroyer on the left side if you turned left, if you're facing the second boss, and it's one of the most consistent areas where people will wipe, is the best way to say it. Of course, the patrol that's running around, you can Mind Soothe the entire pack, and in my opinion, you always should. There's not really any massive stressor to always be going into the next pull, into the next pull, into the next pull in this dungeon. The timer is not bad as long as you are able to survive a lot of these larger hits that are coming out and not just stacking up the deaths too frequently either. Taking advantage again of any stops that you have on hand. Namely, knockbacks in this group are a little bit harder to come by, but there's times where I'll kind of stand out just enough so that I can fear one mob to avoid them from being right on top of more healthy enemies that Sanguine's not going to drop. But usually, as a priest especially, you're kind of leaning on the rest of the group to be able to help you there. As always, I am multi-dotting these Scorchlings and multi-dotting as much as I possibly can going into these openers. And then once I do get a Penance cast off to continue spreading around my Purge the Wickeds, that's when I'm immediately flexing into shielding myself to benefit from my force set, and then using all of my cooldowns really to make sure that people are staying alive. With these Destroyers on Fortified, I'm fine using just a lot of cooldowns. I pretty much used everything there, was Barrier as well as Rapture into a Shadow Covenant burst, because when you have Cinder Weavers, even if it's just one, but you have Cinder Weavers at the same time as the Destroyer damage, like I mentioned before what happened to Karm, it's just really easy for people to get comboed down, and it gives you an extra layer of safety to watch for, especially when you know that you have cooldowns on hand because you're not rushing into the next pulls. We had our entire group basically kind of like pooling damage after killing that 3-pack of casters, taking their time with it, and then we're able to start moving on into that second boss. Otherwise gear, as you can see on your screen, I later on crafted a Lariat, and I'm having an on-use Shadow Gem that I was playing with in raids most of the time. I did switch off of that Shadow Gem since then, but It's not a bad trinket to be able to run. Broodkeeper I had almost entirely spec'd into my tank, but for boss fights I would probably dump it onto like the hunter as well. Throughout that first burst of damage coming out of this second boss, I was really on the back foot because I had used all my cooldowns previously, but the damage, especially when you can reliably make sure that you're getting all the interrupts like my group is, the damage usually is not that high on a 21. You just have to deal with the dot effects, and if your group is focusing it down well, which they should, you're quickly able to get into execute range and take advantage of things like Shadow or Death to make sure you're efficiently, effectively topping everybody off. We did have an issue of dropping Darkness immediately as we started stacked up onto this Firestorm mob. The issue at hand being that people couldn't see which way the boulders were going. And so I think one of our later calls for Darkness, we wait until the boulder comes out and then immediately drop Darkness so that everyone's going to be kind of on the same page. One of the big problems with this boss fight, or an easy way to like kill your key, is if you have the Blazehoof casting a boulder into a wall, into the alchemist tables, into a tree. Anything that the boulder makes contact with will then explode and deal an insane amount of damage. And so it's extremely easy to brick your key as a result of this, just because the alchemist table is a solid object, or a tree is a little bit too close to one melee DPS player, or something along those lines, right? Those things absolutely can happen, do happen a lot, and we want to make sure we're moving a lot so that we're not kind of getting backed into corners at all, because that's another easy way to die. So we're going all the way onto the Thunderhead side, again, not the Flame Gullet side, but the Thunderhead side, just to make sure we always have space and we always have room to be able to work with. The achievement in this dungeon on Mythic, like the Mythic 0 achievements, is literally to go to every single pool of the different Dragonflights and then set the eggs on fire. So you never have to worry about resetting this boss whatsoever. You can drag her wherever you like, as long as you like, just to make sure you're not having her positioned a little bit too closely to alchemy tables or trees or walls where she can drop a boulder, it hits the wall, it hits the surface, and immediately explodes. That's a really important thing to be able to have on hand. From a healer perspective, I'm calling for either defensives or I'm using my own Rapture. Some kind of combination that you have on hand is always important to communicate to people. So that way you can have some resource at your disposal to be able to sort of smooth out the damage. I started this fight with like 40%, 30% mana or something along those lines, and I've never had to worry all that much. So depending on how comfortable you are with the encounter, you don't have to stress too terribly much with your team. After the fight ends, I did go and get mana, because I believe that they changed this first mob onto the bridge from last I remember in beta. It used to Lightning Storm almost immediately, but now you do have a decent amount of time before that does go out. If your mana is in good shape, you can always drop your Mass Dispel here, but I had sufficient time to drink from 10% mana to like 70% or so, if you see it here. I had plenty of time to be able to sit there and drink, and our DPS are already pulling the next set of mobs and getting ready for the next set and going from there. One issue with this pull and the next one is that there's a lot of these like hammer frontals that go out onto the tank, and it's extremely, extremely easy for your melee to get cleaved in the process. And so you have to make sure your tank is standing in one similar position, and that everybody else is not standing on top of your tank, because as you saw, there's a lot of extra thunderclap damage that goes out from those warrior mobs, and every little bit does have an impact as you're progressing on these fights. So it's always important to watch out for. Throughout these thundercloud dudes that you can Mass Dispel, usually I was trying to make sure that I was Mass Dispelling them when we got to the Tempest Channelers. Not the Flame Channelers, but the Tempest Channelers that do the Lightning Storms. That's where it's really important to make sure that they're cleansed. Not so much on these like smaller pulls that we're in right now, but definitely the ones where you have to deal with Lightning Storm, because those are a lot more challenging, because you have to sit there, tunnel heal, and be prepared for all of the incoming hits. And when you have to also watch your feet in the process, it's just too easy to be able to fall over. Once again, this timer, but we're all like, actually our hunter didn't even have 4-piece throughout this run, for what it's worth. I think everybody's like 405 to like 408 in terms of their overall gearing. And so our gear was in very good shape but also not some crazy, insane, unachievable number. A lot of people had mostly M+ gear as well that they were able to upgrade via Valor, and a lot of this dungeon is built off the back of momentum. Making sure that you have cooldowns and that you have everybody together and that you're prioritizing the same target makes a really big difference in the flow that you have going through the dungeon. And just like that previous pull, where we had a Flame Channeler but no Tempest Channeler, there's a lot of these pulls where you save damage, save cooldowns, save resources, or pool them up as you go into the next one to make it easier to kill off. That's a really big focal point of this dungeon. It's a really, really big area to focus on, and I cannot even begin to stress enough how important it is. For this final trash pack that you have going out, the boss does put out a bunch of different dots, and you have to deal with all the thunderclouds that spawn multiple different times. So this is, again, where you pull out another CC order or another cooldown order. We had Darkness, we had Barrier, and Rallying Cry on hand. And so, obviously, we ripped the Darkness first, since everybody's in a fairly healthy position, and you're starting from a position of strength where you can multi-dot everything and control where all the damage is going out onto players. Then there's the Channeler Storm Shield, which you just have to break. And then the Channeler is going to begin with the Lightning Storms once more. So with this, we were able to get everybody out. I try to snipe some Shadow or Deaths, and I get one. I wanted to get one more, but the timing wasn't exactly the way I wanted it to be. And then again, the Thunderclouds will instantly die if you rip a Master Spell onto them, but you just got to make sure people are properly going to be watching their feet as you go through it. This was only the second death that we had throughout this run, and then we have one more Lightning Storm going out, and that's where we rip the Rapture, and I believe this is also where we started the Battle Res onto Humanity, yeah. Because right after that, it's all of the ads all together, and then you have this Storm Shield, which must be broken in order to guarantee that you're not going to just take a crazy amount of damage. So this run, we had a death due to the Inferno damage, but also a cast going through on the player at the exact same time. And then we had a death to just the elementals spewing onto the ground and jumping out at people. A few different deaths like that, but they're very, very common ways for players to die, and so it's insanely important to take your time through the dungeon, make sure you're cycling and know which different cooldowns you're going to cycle through. If you were going to do this as like a Holy Priest, for example, knowing to weave between like Divine Word and Apotheosis, since they're such short and effective cooldowns, does make a really big difference. On Erkhart and Sarak, or whatever his name is, Kyrakka, there it is. Obviously, dispelling the tank on cooldown, trying to milk as much damage into the dragon as you're going to. All these things help a lot. Positioning, I think, makes a really big world of difference. And so what we wanted to do is be in between both pillars when we started this fight, and away from the balcony. The balcony is really, really tough to be able to maneuver when you have a lot of different fire puddles getting moved out into the room. And this gives you almost 360 degrees to be able to work with, and make sure that you are constantly able to find some other way to reorganize or maneuver. So for me, I know I have time to be able to stand still and then reposition and move as I want to. We make sure we specifically don't hit Kyrakka until he lands. There's a really interesting point where if they're a little over 50%, you wait and don't damage them until they land to do a fire breath, and then you damage them as much as you possibly can. And this is the result that we have right here. Since we burned to like 30 or 40% when Kyrakka landed, pushed past that point, and then she goes up onto the balcony, this allowed everybody to be able to maximize their damage and make it so that the dragon only really had one Flame Gullet moment going out. So what I'd like to do with this was to make sure I had Rapture available to put out a large amount of shields on everybody and smooth out that incoming damage. And that allows you to have more breathing room to think about where you're positioned, where everybody else is positioned, and where you or others are dropping their fire. Once Kyrakka does die, or as you're dealing with a possibly second fire phase, as you would on Tyrannical Week, we do move back to the pillars where we got onto the bridge, just so that we have, again, more space to work with. I think one of the big mistakes that can happen on this fight is if you sit on the balcony for too long, or your tank keeps you on the balcony for too long, it makes a really big difference in terms of your options to move around. and it just adds, you know, a lot more pain and suffering that you don't want to deal with. So that's my run throughout Ruby Life Pools. If you have any questions about how I'm dealing with these boss fights, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. I also already have a couple of thumbnails made for this instance, so if there's a different way you'd like me to do these videos, please let me know as well. Check out the live stream, also linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.